So if the Queensland government, the Victorian government, the South Australian government, the West Australian government were actually interested in solving suffering instead of just ending lives, they would be putting all of their effort into palliative care funding and training before we even considered turning our doctors into killers.
G'day and welcome to episode 46 of The Other Side. I'm Damien Curry. This is a show that amplifies the voices of the smartest liberal free market, freedom-focused thinkers in Australia and from around the world on the issues that matter most, to give you the other side of the story that our very lopsided old media outlets tend to leave out. We come to you a couple of times a week from our studios in Brisbane and Melbourne, Australia, and you can catch us on YouTube and Facebook on the Discernible platform, along with lots of other great shows. So do sign up, subscribe, click all the bells, and most importantly, share. Euthanasia laws were introduced into the Queensland Parliament a few weeks back and are also before the South Australian Parliament right now. Tasmania and Western Australia have passed their legislation in recent weeks, and Victoria legalised voluntary assisted dying way back in 2017, with their law coming into effect in mid-2019, and its first use happened in July that year. This is an issue that tends not to fall along traditional party lines politically, and it really divides small government liberals and libertarians, because some see it as big government intervening into a part of life that needs no intervention, while others see it as government withdrawing from intruding into an individual's right to choose to die when and however they wish. Queensland's euthanasia laws will be put to a vote in September after a 12-week consultation period. Both Labor and the Queensland LNP say that they will permit MPs to vote their conscience on the issue and not be bound to follow the party lines. Now, because Queensland has no upper house of parliament, and because the state has 4-year fixed parliamentary terms, and the government is in its first year of a new term, everyone thinks the laws will almost definitely pass. This was the Queensland Premier on the day she introduced the legislation to that state's parliament late last month.
Its introduction today represents an historic step forward in Queensland, a step towards compassion, towards choice and autonomy, and most importantly, Mr. Speaker, towards dignity. Mr. Speaker, I commend this bill to the House.
The Northern States' laws are based on those passed in Victoria, as WA and South Australia's also are. But Queensland's go a lot further than the other states. Like other states, a person seeking voluntary assisted dying must be at least 18 years old. They must have been diagnosed with a medical condition that's advanced, progressive, and will ultimately cause their death. But unlike some other states, that death could be up to 12 months away. In Victoria, death must be imminent and likely within 6 months. Another controversial difference is that health workers, including nurses, will be allowed to initiate a discussion about euthanasia with a patient, something the WA law requires a doctor to do and Victorian law doesn't allow at all. The patient must at the same time be informed about all the treatment options available, including palliative care. Another key difference, people who have a disability or mental illness will be able to access euthanasia in Queensland, but only if they have a terminal condition not related solely to suffering from their disability or mental illness. Under the Victorian laws, those with a disability or mental illness are completely excluded. A person must be able to make their own decision at the time the substance is administered. It cannot be acted upon if expressed in an advance health directive. Also, the decision-making capacity of the patient must be assessed multiple times, and it must be evident that they're acting without coercion. The patient will need to make 3 separate requests and can change their mind at any time in the process. An assessment process also has to be undertaken by 2 doctors, but these can just be GPs under the Queensland and WA laws, whereas in Victoria it has to be 1 GP and a specialist in the area related to the terminal illness.
There are going to be opposing views. I understand this. But I also understand these are deeply personal issues. And in fact, having seen firsthand the suffering of both my grandmother and my uncle, it is heartbreaking, and no one wants to see that. But it is a deeply personal choice, and this bill will give people the choice to end their life with dignity. We often talk about the dignity of work. Well, there is dignity as well in the way in which people choose to end their life. That's not to say that palliative care is not an option as well, because we know that palliative care is being utilised at the moment by thousands of Queenslanders, and that's why my government is investing $171 million to ensure that people have that choice.
Anyone found to have coerced a person to make a request to access voluntary assisted dying will face up to 7 years jail in Queensland. But, and this I find very unusual indeed, anyone found to have coerced a person to revoke a request to access voluntary assisted dying will also face up to 7 years jail. This means a priest or a religious minister or a psychologist or a counsellor, relative, friend, anyone who convinces someone to revoke their euthanasia request could go to jail. And that, for me, seems utterly ridiculous. The leader of Katter's Australian Party, Robbie Katter, told a protest gathering outside the Parliament building in Brisbane the day the bill was introduced that as a 5-second proposition, do you think people should have the right and freedom to take their own life if they're suffering, euthanasia sounds okay. But when you realise what the implications of it are down the road if it's not regulated properly, it's a different story. Someone who is opposed to euthanasia is the host of popular conservative podcast Pello Talk and founder of the Good Source platform, David Pello. And he agreed to join us on the other side to help explain the case against in a bit more detail. I spoke to David earlier from our interview studio and asked him to explain the anti-euthanasia position for us in very simple terms.
Oh, look, this can be a very long and complex and nuanced conversation. And the reality is that...
Well, for God's sake, David, this is a media interview, so we can't be having that.
Well, the reality is...
Although this show aims to give you a little extra time, little extra breathing space. So.
Well, look, I can take 2 hours or 2 minutes and anywhere.
I'll take the 2 minute version. Yeah.
But here's the two simplest and I think bulletproof arguments on why we shouldn't do that without bringing morality into it, without bringing religion into it. And there's so many more arguments. I mean, I can't think of a libertarian that trusts government to do anything but to safely legislate death as therapy. That seems like the opposite of a libertarian small government kind of position. However, the first thing politicians, legislators, and voters need to know is there is no jurisdiction in the entire world or human experience which has ever created a legislative framework which has eliminated casualties, unintended deaths from the liberalisation of euthanasia laws. Every single jurisdiction, including Victoria, has had deaths which have been unintended and otherwise thought to have been preventable by so-called safeguards in their legislation. It's a myth that government can create safe legislation for state-sanctioned killing by health professionals.
Tell me more about that. Is there a specific case that you can refer to, David, just to explain that concept for us, because it's a little fuzzy. You're basically
let me give you an example, and this will also refute one of the common arguments, which is it happens anyway already, so we might as well legislate it, regulate it, and make it safe. Those people who were willing to operate outside of the law before death as therapy was liberalised will go further, not operate within the law, but operate still external to the law. And now they're in a context where death is actually legitimised and normalised as a therapeutic option for healthcare professionals. One of the cases that's quite well documented was a medical professional, a doctor, was treating a lady, senior and advanced in years, and she had profound what's that condition where people lose their sense of awareness and consciousness and
Alzheimer's disease or dementia? Or
dementia, thank you. Dementia. I'm not sure why I had a mental blank with that, but she had severe dementia. She was diagnosed with it. And she had an advanced medical directive, an advanced healthcare directive that said when the time came, she was willing to be euthanized, to voluntary or assisted suicide, to be put to death rather than endure the suffering and indignity of advanced dementia. And I've seen dementia in my grandma. It is an unkind disease that's hard to watch. But it came to a point where the doctor decided that this lady's dementia was bad enough, and that without the lady's voluntary indication, she decided that the lady should die. And so what this doctor did was, and the lady understood what, the patient understood what was trying to be done, and she refused. She said, "No, I don't want to die. I'm not ready." And so the doctor actually called the family in to witness the passing. She ignored the patient's wishes, brought the family in to say goodbye, and slipped some sedatives into the lady's coffee to try and knock her out before they gave her the lethal injection. The sedatives didn't quite work, and as they're trying to put the intravenous or needle into the elderly lady's arm, she realizes that she's trying to be killed, and she starts fighting. The doctor asks the family to hold her down while she's administered the lethal injection. And ultimately, the doctor prevailed, the patient lost, and the family was traumatized, having to hold down their dear loved one while this advanced medical directive was applied involuntarily. Now, this is in the Netherlands, which has had euthanasia for a long time, and is a great example of the fact that the best legislation you can try to bring in the first instance will constantly be ratcheted further and further away from safety. Age limits and certain conditions will all be softened and reduced and moved further away from safety. And the lady was actually, the doctor, the medical professional, was actually brought before a disciplinary tribunal, and her behaviour was reviewed, the entire case and her conduct and decisions and circumstances were scrutinised, and she got off scot-free without any kind of professional or criminal consequence of any kind whatsoever. The point is, there are no jurisdictions without plenty of unintended casualties from this kind of liberalisation. If we're going to pretend that we've got safe legislation, we're deceiving ourselves. That is a myth. It doesn't exist. There will be unintended casualties. And if that's something an advocate for euthanasia is comfortable with, I can't argue against that. But this is the reality. There is no jurisdiction in the world having implemented euthanasia laws where the laws have not changed, where unintended casualties have not resulted, given enough time.
Okay, point 2, you said there was a second point?
So the second point that is just common sense for the average person is the question, are we trying to end lives or are we trying to end suffering? Because the argument seems to be all the time that the real problem we're trying to find a solution for here is suffering, undue suffering from a compassionate, caring health system. And I agree. Who wouldn't oppose suffering and want to do everything within our strength to end suffering? But the problem is we haven't done everything within our strength to end suffering. Proper palliative care is the solution to end-of-life suffering. And if we pretend as a society that we value life, then we shouldn't bypass all of these sensible, sober solutions which are at our disposal and go straight to considering death a therapeutic option. What we should be doing is pouring all the funding that's required into palliative care, both the development of the technologies and medications, as well as the proper training in those that already exist. And palliative care is incredibly advanced already, and there is nearly no need for undue, uncontrollable suffering at all, despite what anecdotes you may hear. Less than 3% of people die with incredible suffering in hospitals, and most of that 3% is solvable with the current understanding, technology, medicines, of pharmacology and palliative care solutions that we have. We just lack the funding and we lack the training. So if the Queensland government, the Victorian government, the South Australian government, the West Australian government were actually interested in solving suffering instead of just ending lives, they would be putting all of their effort into palliative care funding and training before we even considered turning our doctors into killers.
Mm. And I guess there's another argument against, which would be the concern about what this might lead to and how it might be misused. That's a big one, I understand, on the opposing side of the argument.
There's a much bigger agenda with much bigger consequences for all of society. This isn't a law which is made for just a couple of individuals and has no impact on everyone else. That's about as naive as thinking you can make a rule for a couple of people to pee in the pool and have it not affect absolutely everybody. The entire culture is polluted by such bad laws. And quite simply, this isn't a case of the horse bolting. This is a case of the bell being rung, and it can't be unrung. And future governments will change the laws that we introduce today. And governments further down the track than that will change the laws that they make. We will constantly be ratcheted towards further and further away from safety. And as a society, I think surely we must say human life is sacred. This isn't a religious thing. This is absolutely a fundamental human value across all cultures and times and worldviews.
So, David, we are in a situation here where, if you're thinking in terms of libertarian or liberal philosophy, you're looking at a situation where we're saying we don't want the government intervening by permitting the non-intervention. And I guess that's the problem for a liberal like me. I'm a bit confused about whether or not I see this as government intervening more or creating more government, or whether it's actually removing government and giving the rights back to the individual.
Yeah.
Is it, from my perspective, I think it's saying to, as an individual, I don't want to suffer in my later years. I don't believe that. I believe that God gave us science in order to use it. So it's kind of a difficult one because I can see how this can get out of hand if we leave it to government and doctors. But it really comes down to the patient's wishes, right? How do we ensure that we are honouring the patient's wishes at all times?
Well, suffering is part of the human experience. It's not something to love and chase and pursue. It is something to be avoided, minimized, etc. And many of the greatest advances in our technology and medicine, etc., have been possible because of the need to remove suffering. By letting this in the door, we do this incredibly naive, almost willfully ignorant thing, and we assume that we know all the consequences that will happen by changing society so fundamentally, by changing the fabric of what it means to care and to do no harm. We assume that if we move these boundaries, that we can see far enough into the flow of consequences that there won't be worse suffering created by our attempt to alleviate suffering. I know of so many anecdotes about old people who now go to the doctor less because they don't want the doctor to offer them death as a therapy. They're afraid of their doctors because the doctor can now do them harm.
There's also the question of euthanasia by non-intervention. So an elderly person deciding not to take their medication, knowing that will hasten their death. What is the view of your view or the view of conservatives on that?
Sure. Look, it's fair to say that euthanasia is such a emotive topic that many conservatives and even many fundamental Christians have a initial reluctance to ban it. In fact, if not support for it. So it's not really a conservative. It probably should be a conservative position, or maybe I just think of an.
It's very complicated. It doesn't. Yes, you're right. I think it doesn't fit the normal.
I think it's somewhat easy to.
You and I are arguing. We don't argue on much.
Yeah, and that's.
I'm not sure I'm not persuaded by your argument. By the way,
that's okay.
Carry on.
Here's the thing to understand: the pro-life position, which is consistently valuing life in every stage and circumstance, doesn't oppose natural death. Euthanasia should only be narrowly defined as deliberate actions taken with the primary intention of prematurely ending a life. So if you have, there's the principle of double effect, for example. If somebody's going through extreme suffering, they should be medicated and everything should be done to end their suffering. If that has the double effect of prematurely ending their life, that is not euthanasia. That is not something that pro-life advocates are opposed to. That is not euthanasia, and that is not something that is currently illegal or not regularly, routinely done. That is already there. That kind of compassionate care is already commonplace and fully permitted by law. That is appropriate. In hospital, everywhere. It's not just palliative care.
Well, I mean, in terms of palliative care, wherever it is, yeah.
Sure, but it's in a nursing home, and it definitely is included in palliative care. But it's very, very common that you can so slow down the body's systems in order to minimize their suffering, and sometimes to the point of even just depriving consciousness, so they don't have to be conscious through those final worst days. That is not euthanasia, and there's no suggestion that should be banned, and it is not currently banned. And so for somebody to abstain from life-saving medication or extreme measures and medical intervention, that is also not suicide or murder or euthanasia or anything immoral. That's just them wanting to die a natural death. And here's one of the most dangerous euphemisms used to propagandize the pro-euthanasia campaign. They call it the right to die, as if that's not already absolutely inevitable for everybody. Everybody already has the right to die. The right to kill yourself or somebody else is the line that society goes too far if it crosses.
On that very succinct summary, my friend, I will leave it there. Thank you very, very much, David, for a really clear and articulate explanation of that side of the argument. And as I said, I'm not convinced that I'm not convinced. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks, Damien.
And that was David Pellow from the Good Source platform and host of the podcast Pellow Talk, speaking to me there from his studio. Well, I think after that heavy discussion, we need a bit of a laugh, especially if, like me, you're starting to get on a little in the age department and a discussion of euthanasia is a little too close to home. Here's comedian Bob Stromberg performing for Dry Bar Comedy on YouTube.
Getting older. I'm getting old. Well, and you are too, by the way. We're all getting older this year. But most of the time you don't even know it. You don't think about it. Except one day you might go, oh, there's a little gray, something like. But normally you don't even think about it, except those special times when you realize I'm getting older. I've been through one of those. I had my 50-year checkup a few years. Actually, it's been nearly 2 decades. They're going on. Just out of interest, how many of you have been through that 50-year checkup stuff for the hilarity yourself? Anybody out there? Anybody? Yeah, okay. You know that's the special one, isn't it? That's the one where the normally healthy person has their first exposure to the whole idea of the colonoscopy. If I could just break that word down for you briefly. Colon, that's the last 5 or 6 feet of the large intestine. And oscopy, Latin word, medical term, literally translated, garden hose with camcorder. My doctor was describing for me what I was going to be going through, and I don't know how I got to be 50 years of age without knowing what that procedure, I don't know how that got, we've been very healthy in my family, I guess. I just didn't know what it was. And so he's describing for me what I would be enduring. And I should tell you that my doctor is actually one of my best friends since college. So for 40 years, we've been close friends. He has a wonderful sense of humor. We've had a great relationship. So as he was telling me what I'm going through, because of our relationship, I thought he was joking. Then to make it worse, I had to drink 2 big plastic bottles of this stuff meant to cleanse my digestive system. And I don't know how you felt about that stuff, ma'am. But I found that stuff to be really effective. 3 a.m., I'm in my favorite place. My wife came in, she said, you did dilute this stuff, didn't you? Well, I would explain it. I'll tell you, for me, one of the great things about getting old, I mean, this is the greatest thing. In the last several years, for the first times, I have become a grandfather. Pretty young house here tonight. Are there any grandparents out here? Any grandparents? Yeah. Oh, look right there. Yeah, same as the colonoscopy people. Amazing. I ask you, grandparents, is there anything like it? There isn't, is it? There's nothing. And we were told this. Do you remember as parents, we were told, wait till your grandparents. We were like, woo-woo. We couldn't understand. I did not even know that I was emotionally capable of experiencing what I did until my grandkids were born. I told my 2 sons, I thought I loved you with my whole heart. But apparently not. Because until your kids were born, I didn't know I had that extra 3/4 left over in there.
That's aging comedian Bob Stromberg performing for Dry Bar Comedy. The link is in our program notes to the full routine. And that's it for another The Other Side. I'm Damien Curry. Please remember to click that subscribe button, please, on all the platforms. There'll be another episode in a couple of days. And if you're following us on YouTube, click the bell, the little bell icon. What that does is it sends you a notification when you log into YouTube that we've got some new content. So you can also sign up at the Discernible crew at discernable.io, because you never know with big tech these days how long we're going to be around for on their platforms. So, we're trying to investigate different platforms and things. It's strange, isn't it? Because we could all work together and be very happy. But it's funny with these big tech firms that you feel like you're fighting against them all the time just to get your show and your content to work. And yet without content producers like us, they don't really have a product. So it's a strange business relationship. And that's what happens when you get businesses that get too big, I think, or in industry monopolies. Anyway, if you'd like to be added to our VIP WhatsApp group, all you got to do is email your WhatsApp number to us at theothersideost@gmail.com. Okay, theothersideost@gmail.com. Then I'll email you back a link, and you can click on that and opt in. And you can go off at any time. The WhatsApp group is a one-way silent group, so other people can't post. It's not going to be a noisy conversation. You just get 2 episode links pushed out to you a week or 3 sometimes, and that's basically it. So it's a good way to keep up with the show and know when it's available and when it's out on the device that you might be actually wanting to watch or listen to it on. Okay, so thanks again for joining us. That's it for episode 46. We'll see you again for episode 47, which will be coming out in about a week. There's going to be a bit of a week gap because I've got a couple of things on between these 2 episodes, but there won't ever be more than 1 week between episodes. So we'll see you again in around about a week, probably around next Friday or Saturday for episode 47.